Good evening. Welcome to the post-viewing discussion of Taxi to the Dark Side. I'm Darryl Li, and we have the honor of being able to discuss this important film with the director, Alex Gibney, as well as with a panel of esteemed experts. Anila Daulatzai, a sociocultural anthropologist who has been working in Afghanistan and with Afghan refugees in Pakistan for several decades, currently based at UC Berkeley, and author of a book in progress called War and What Remains, Everyday Life in Contemporary Kabul. We're joined as well by the award-winning journalist, Anand Gopal, the author of No Good Men Among the Living, currently a fellow at the Type Media Center, and someone who has also extensive experience reporting from on the ground in Afghanistan. So I thought we would start off, Alex, who, again, I should also reintroduce, is not only the director of Taxi to the Dark Side, but has made many important and award-winning films, of which I can only mention a few off the top of my head. Enron, Smartest Guys in the Room, the film about the rise and fall of Elliot Spitzer, whose media title escapes me, as well as many others. Alex Gibney, this film made a lot of waves when it came out. It won an Oscar. And I'm just sort of curious as to your reactions, sort of viewing it now 14 years later, in light of all that has transpired since.
Well, I mean, you're right. The film was shot in 2006, came out in 2007. A lot has changed. And yet certain salient aspects of the film, sadly, are not as maybe the world hasn't changed as much as I would have thought. The other thing about the film that I find interesting is that at the time we were kind of feeling in the dark. We didn't properly understand a lot of what was really going on. And one of the things that the film did was to introduce people to the idea that a lot of these interrogation techniques were really pioneered and engineered and pushed by the CIA, which was not something that was routinely accepted at the time. Now we all know a lot more about that, and I'm working on a follow-up film that really gets into that. But you really see how a small program designed to be secret can mutate and migrate like a pernicious virus, to use a more contemporary metaphor, in ways that just undermine all of the principles we claim to stand for. So that's one of the things that I see that I find fascinating looking back at it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was really interesting for me watching it is that, I think one of the striking aspects of kind of the post-Trumpian world is that torture, in the time that the film is made, torture is still it's still something scandalous. It's still something that has to be denied. It has to be obfuscated. It has to be covered up. And in more recent years, you have, on the one hand, the mainstreaming and entering into respectability of celebrating torture, even more so than back in those days. But then also kind of a broader acceptance that this is what happened, right? Although it's an acceptance that doesn't bring with it necessarily more calls for accountability, right? It's like at the very moment mainstream America, quote unquote, recognizes that torture happened, it also sort of, it kind of waves its hands and says, okay, this is a thing that sort of happened in the past. So that, to me, was one of the kind of striking aspects of this. One thing that I was really curious about is that I think you do an excellent job of getting access to and positioning so many of the important players in the drama in relation to each other, right? Everything from like the low-level guards who were scapegoated for this to some of the high-level officials, people like John Yoo, of course, who are involved in these policies. And then at the end of the film, you have a clip of your father, and it's a strikingly kind of personal note on which to end the film. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more of, your thought process for that.
Well, those are two issues, and I'll take the least personal first, and then I'll get to my father in a second. But I made up my mind from the beginning. I was originally approached to do a film, and usually it's not. I was approached in a way I don't normally accept the invitation for, which is to take a broad subject and make a film about it without a story. But I was looking for a story. Somebody wanted me to do a film about torture, which is a very difficult topic to do a film about. I agreed to do it, and I was looking for a story, and I found the story of Dilawar. But in finding the story of Dilawar, I was determined to use the murder mystery of Dilawar to understand the system of torture, because it wasn't a few bad apples here. It was a broad system, and that's why in leading from Bagram to Abu Ghraib to Guantanamo and ultimately back to Washington, D.C., you see what happens when a virus like this mutates, when you allow the rule of law to erode, and suddenly you're in a torture system. Forced drift has taken place, and so every step along the way, we wanted to find people who intersected. We found members of that MP and MI unit that traveled to, the MI unit that traveled to Abu Ghraib from Bagram. And obviously we found people who were at the prison in Bagram, like Mozambique, who ended up in Guantanamo. It was a very complicated job of kind of putting the pieces together. But I also feel very strongly about trying to find participants in the system. And that occasioned a lot of very difficult hand-wringing in the cutting room during the process, because over time I came to feel extremely sympathetic toward the guards and to some extent the military intelligence folks down at the bottom, who I felt were put in a position of torturing people. And yet, because I felt that it was really the policies on high that was goading them to do what they did. Yet at the same time, I reckon in the cutting room that I was also kind of letting them off the hook on kind of a personal basis. And we came back around and included some material that also cast them in a bad light too. So it was a complicated process of both, showing the system, but also showing the humanity of the people involved in the system, from everywhere from, a taxi driver in the tiny town of Yakubi to, an assistant, an assistant to the Secretary of State of the United States of America, and various lawyers who went to Guantanamo and so forth and so on. So it was that level I tried very hard to get at. In terms of my dad, my dad was a naval interrogator in World War II. And this was an issue that was really animating for him, because, they, I can remember he lived in Tokyo for a long time, and I could remember visiting him often. And we'd go out to a sushi bar, or go out drinking and having sake with people. And very often it was with former prisoners of war with whom he had interrogated. They were very much of the rapport building school, and he was deeply offended by everything that had happened with Cheney and Rumsfeld and this new position that we could get tough. It didn't matter, because these people were a different kind of people, and so we didn't need to treat them like human beings. So he was dying during this period, and he felt very strongly that he wanted to have his say. So I had a little amateur camera with me. I took him off an oxygen machine and set up the camera, and we shot that interview. For a long time, I felt uncomfortable about foisting it on the team, but at some point, I said, "Look, I shot this video. Perhaps there's a role for this to play," and everyone saw it and was moved by it, and we put it in. It also occasioned me to change the way I made films, because in the prior film, I did a film called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, which was narrated by an actor, which was very traditional at the time, a guy named Peter Coyote, who has a wonderful voice, much better voice than me. But after I put my dad in the film, I reckoned I couldn't get an actor to read lines that I had written, and I felt I had to make it personal, and not because I felt so confident in my voice as a narrator, but because it was me speaking, and that was somehow more honest. And so every time since then, if I make a film that has narration, and many of my investigative films do, I now use my own voice, and that's on account of my dad. And by the way, I thanked him. I thanked two people, or I said I was inspired by two people when I gave my speech at the Oscars, which was a nervous-making moment. One was Dilawar, and one was my dad. Both of whom, had died by that point.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I had another question about some of the aesthetic choices that are also political choices in making a film like this. And I'm thinking specifically about all of the photographs of naked bodies, both alive and dead, they're part of the, kind of the visual grammar of the war on terror debate, for better or for worse. And they're also, of course, recurring in the film. So I was wondering, what kind of the thought process had been, or the discussions between you and your team in how to use these images and how to display them when you were making the film.
It was very difficult, and when we went through a lot of hand-wringing about it, I wouldn't say. Let's just say there were much worse images that we had in our cutting room, many of which were brutalizing to us, but we had become desensitized to them, and we constantly had to show the film to novices who hadn't seen it before, so that we could find a balance where people wouldn't just simply shut down because these images were too horrific. At the same time, I felt that the inhumanity of stripping somebody naked against their will was a powerful thing that needed to be seen and acknowledged. And the power of those images is to generate a sense of revulsion and horror. As well as, we debated at great length too about whether we should show the autopsy photos of Dilawar. These photos were ones that I didn't find until very late in the process of the film, and I found them in a lawyer's office in San Antonio, Texas. But I felt it was important to include those, both because they were the body. I mean, those were photos of the body of Dilawar, and also they were just prime evidence of how badly he had been beaten. It was not, they were crime scene photos, and this was a crime story. And we were building a case, and it was to be incontestable about the fact that he was murdered. So, for that reason, I felt it was important to include. I'll say one other thing about this, one other debate that we had, which has to do with the, ethics of showing people who may not have wanted, or who certainly didn't, volunteer to be photographed. And that's the question of, do you obscure their faces? Do you put bars over their eyes? In a number of cases, we chose a very different method, which was to blur the face and keep the eyes in focus. And the reason we did that was it was a choice where we were obscuring who they were, but not destroying their humanity. There's that phrase, the eyes are the window into the soul. And we didn't want to take away their humanity by, obscuring their eyes. So we blurred their faces and kept their eyes in focus. Whether, that was the correct decision or not is a matter of debate, but that's how we sorted out the issue.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because in so many of the Abu Ghraib photos, the faces are obscured already because the people in them are hooded, right? And it's meant as a dehumanizing tactic, but it also kind of gets you out of the anonymity sort of puzzle or debate that you were kind of discussing.
Sorry to interrupt, Darryl, but to your point, one of the issues that we debated, in other words, the idea that they were hooded was dehumanizing, and we felt that if we had an opportunity to show their humanity, it was incumbent on us to do so. So it was a complicated and long-standing, conversation we had in the cutting room.
So I want to turn to Anila and then to Anand to get their thoughts on the film. And the film, and I don't mean this as a criticism. It's it's a film that is it's made by an American and with mostly American characters and kind of an American audience in mind, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And but it also takes place in this context of the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. And Anila, you and Anand have both in different ways done so much work in Afghanistan. So I think it's, I would be really interested to get kind of your reflections on the film. So Anila, I thought I would start with you because also I know that one of the areas of your research, of course, is gender, and how certain narratives of feminism have kind of been conscripted into the war on terror. And there's not a lot of Afghan women in this film for reasons that make sense, according to the design of the film. But I really appreciate your kind of commentary on the intersection of these issues or on any other aspect of the film.
Thank you so much, Darryl. And thank you, Alex and Anand. It's very good to meet you both. And just to be here discussing this important film. So I watched it when it first came out, and then rewatched it now and again, just thinking through like the passage of time and what that's done, but also trying to think through what it must be like for the filmmaker. So I appreciated you asking that question, Darryl. For me, I'm trying to think about like the visual and the visible, right? So torture was the invisible that films like yours and so many others since made visible, right? And then I'm trying to think, because in my research, I try to look at serial war and the analytic of serial war, right? So not just the past 20 years, but the past 43 years, right? That war that Afghans have faced and that the US has been involved, right? And so if we look at the past 43 years of war, how do we look at almost, that pernicious virus that you were speaking of, Alex, right? Is the pernicious violence war, or is it torture, which is kind of a technology of war, right? War is the regime, and torture and so many other things, drones that become permissible and acceptable as technologies of war. And I'm trying to think of like how, because there's so much work that I see on Afghanistan that's important in this, the specific ways you followed a story in Delaware's, family and the story and what happened. That specificity is so important, right? But we lost war as a character, like in your film, right? Or have we taken for granted that, like, and normalized the violence of war and looking at the exceptional violence of like torture, for example, right? And so I'm wondering how, Anand's work as a journalist, your, work as a filmmaker, my work, as an anthropologist, how, what gets obscured, right? And are these decisions that you have to make as a filmmaker because you have a wider audience? I have maybe like 10 people that may read my stuff, right? That you don't want to talk about war because the Afghan war was the good war, right? The acceptable war, the war that liberals thought was the one that made sense, right? And I'm trying to think, with the film, because that was something that I wanted the war, right? And war in general, not just the U.S. occupation, to be in the story, right? My work with in Afghanistan has focused on widows, right? So I appreciate Darryl, you speaking about the gender aspect, but and I understand why Delaware's she's a widow, right? And the child aren't in the story, but how is it that we think about the different kinds of violence that have become normalized and exceptional, and a war in Afghanistan, which for me largely, like whether it's the lefties or the liberal, it was largely an accepted war, right? So I have a lot to offer there, but I'm just thinking aloud, so don't mind that it's a bit all over the place. But for me, I'm trying to look at how in each of our work, but especially in the movie, right, war is not a character, right? So it's almost like the visible has become invisible. The war that's just everywhere becomes that which is obscured, and the torture, which is the invisible, has become what we can speak on, right? Just thoughts on that, right? Because I want to think with all of you.
I mean, just a brief, just to continue that conversation, I think that the issue of war hovers over the film, but it wasn't. It certainly wasn't a particular, or it wasn't the agenda of the film. And indeed, I mean, there are, part of the film discusses the rules of war, which is kind of an odd concept if you think about it. I mean, the idea of a war is to kill other people. And then through the Geneva Conventions, there became established rules of war. How do you behave in a war humanely, even while you're taking somebody else's life? And it's one of the things that I found interesting in the whole debate about torture, which is one of the things that made it peculiar and more complicated than I would have thought of. In other words, when you capture a prisoner, they're subject to Geneva Conventions protections on prisoners of war, which is one of the reasons that the Bush administration tried to say that members of Al Qaeda were not subject to the Geneva Conventions. But the principle of the Geneva Conventions, in a weird way, if you're going to find a positive in war, in a weird way, the idea is that when you capture somebody, that person could be you. So there is a sense of common humanity between two people. And therefore, you're not allowed to abuse that person when you have that much power over them. That's why you're not allowed to torture them, at least according to the law. So war hovers over that in weird and paradoxical ways. The other thing that's interesting about this larger context, and it's mentioned briefly in the beginning of the film, as John Yoo makes a comment, there was a big debate, which many of us have forgotten now, sadly, as to whether or not what happened on 9/11 was an act of war or was it a crime. And if it was a crime, then criminals would be sought out, captured, and prosecuted. But if it was a war, well, then the rules of war apply. Now, the Bush administration wanted to have it both ways. But I think it's still an enduring question, particularly when it comes to the global war on terror, which has caused so much damage. If it wasn't a war, then people would have to behave as they behave in criminal investigations, which has rules, even though wars are supposed to have rules. So, I take Anila, I very much take your point. Obviously, my lens was narrow, and I think it's important, particularly in a film, to focus, because if you're trying to deal with too much, then everything gets lost. But in this case, issues of war and crime hovered over this narrative about torture in ways that I hope would be provocative. I mean, one of the things I hope in the films that I make is that they're not discussion enders, they're discussion starters. They're agents provocateurs made to, get people to continue to talk about these things. And one of the odd things that I discovered when I embarked on this process, which was a very dark road for me, was that I learned something about the dark corners of humanity that were difficult to learn, but also how complicated the subject was in many ways that had all sorts of kind of concentric circles around them. And so we didn't deal with war directly, but I think war and crime hover around the edges of the story in ways that are important.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting, I'm so glad you brought this up, Alex, because one of the other striking aspects of watching the film with the benefit of all of this hindsight is that this debate that really framed the post 9/11 era of, is it war, is it crime, and so on. I think that with the rise of the movement for Black lives in the United States in the past 7 or 8 years, it's really difficult to think about the dichotomy between law enforcement and war in the same way, right? In the sense that, like the kind of implicit value of this war versus law thing is that, well, law enforcement is, that's the right choice, that's the better choice, that's the more humane choice. And, speaking as an attorney, right, if I'm representing a client, of course, I want to get the best deal possible. And maybe I'll conclude that going to the criminal justice system is, a less bad route than into the military detention system. So, I mean, I get that, but there's also a way in which the terms of that debate kind of, normalized the idea of the US as like this generally, rule of law, human rights respecting country in a way that I think was also missing a lot of what was happening inside the United States, especially with the explosion of racialized mass incarceration in recent decades, in ways where sometimes the connections and the continuities between what was happening in the war on terror abroad and just, everyday sort of carceral violence at home, that a lot of those connections were sometimes overlooked or missed opportunities in the way that the whole debate kind of played out. But anyway, sorry, that's my just editorial digression. One thing that I wanted to bring in Anand about is the other, structuring condition of this film is kind of the fact, it's built around this one crime, and you have a victim, Dilawar, who, is arguably like innocent in kind of the conventional sense of the term. And of course, I'm sure you've experienced versions of pushback, that are like, well, what about the bad guys? What about the Taliban? What about the terrorists and so on? And, Anand, I think your journalism is so valuable in part because you have spent so much time understanding, the other side of this war, the combatants, who were trying to reject the United States. So I would be really curious about your thoughts on the film, either from, drawing from that vantage point, but also from all the other reporting that you've done and all the other, Afghans from other walks of life that you've spent time with over the course of your work.
Oh, sure. This was actually the first time I had seen the film. I wish I had seen it before, and I was really blown away by it. I thought it was a really profound film and really prescient, given that it was written in 2007. And I say prescient because I was recently in Afghanistan, and I was there as the evacuation was ongoing, and it was on everybody's television screens. And there was a lot of soul searching here in the United States about why the U.S. lost this war. And I think the film basically explains why America lost the war. There's the case of Dilawar, but there were like thousands of Dilawars. Now, in his case, it's in some ways singular because he was killed directly by the U.S. military, but there was many others who were tortured to death by American proxies. And the film's about Bagram. There are many other smaller versions of Bagram dotted around the country. There was Kandahar airfield, which I think was briefly mentioned actually in the film as well, which at the time in 2002, U.S. troops were calling it Camp Slappy because that was just known as a place where people would be sent and tortured. And Darryl, I met many people from many walks of life who went through that system, some of whom were Taliban, some of whom hated the Taliban, some of whom were were just trying to get by, and ended up getting thrust into this war and becoming Taliban as a result of this. There's the example of somebody I know who was, seeing some of the images there brought back for me memories of people that I had talked to and befriended over the years. As one person was a school teacher who was arrested in 2002, taken to Kandahar and hung from the ceiling just exactly in the way those drawings show. And he was beaten, he was stripped naked, and then he was released after 6 months, and only because his family was able to pay basically a ransom to the Afghan militiamen who were the ones feeding the intelligence to the U.S. And then he went back home, and then 2 months later he was arrested again and taken back, and this process happened again like 3 or 4 times, and then eventually he joined the Taliban. And so that's like the experience, I think, of a lot of ordinary Afghans. And Anil, I think your question is really important and interesting about like looking at torture versus the war in general. One of the things I noticed about the conversation more recently about what's happened in the last couple of months is that the war itself has actually completely been bracketed or ignored. And what's been happening, which is actually a tragedy for the Taliban to just take over in a very diverse, not monolithic country, that's a tragedy. and people are wanting to leave and they deserve to leave and have a better life. There's another part of the story in which that there's many people who've been living in continuous war for 2 decades. And most of that war that they're experiencing isn't actually the kind of violations of the Geneva Conventions or violations of the laws of war. They're just everyday killings. You can be, according to the laws of war, it's not illegal in the laws of war to kill people, right? It's illegal to kill people in certain types of ways. But so I did a survey in a village in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan where on average, every single family lost 10 to 12 members of their family. And that was not in a single bombing or an airstrike, but in 8 or 9 different incidents: killed by a sniper, caught in a crossfire, hit a roadside bomb, etc. And so it is actually a real challenge, which I think, as Alex probably does, I grapple with all the time, because for us to communicate the realities of what's happening to an American public, we often have to take examples of the more extreme cases of the violations of the laws of war, whereas the reality is that, it's war itself which is the most destructive to most people. I thought the film did a great job in trying to bring that reality to the public. It doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. There's other, it takes a lot of different media to do this simultaneously. So, there's a great scholar, Samuel Moyne, who has a book out right now about the ways in which we look at the laws of war and how that's almost sanitizes the way in which war is fought, because only when the laws of war are violated does it kind of erupt onto American consciousness. And otherwise, it just kind of is something that happens in the background. That's a challenge that I think all of us who are trying to communicate the realities of war have to grapple with.
One other thing I might mention, I'm glad you mentioned that new book, because it might be worth talking about that later. I have views on it, but I think it's a very provocative notion. But the just on my pet topic, torture. I mean, I'm now doing a follow-up film to Taxi to the Dark Side that's called A Forever Prisoner, and it's the story of Abu Zubaydah, and I dig a little bit deeper into where and how the torture.
Alex, you might want to tell the audience a little bit about who Abu Zubaydah is.
I'm sorry. Abu Zubaydah is a Palestinian who was captured in Afghanistan, in Pakistan in March 2002, and was taken to Thailand. And he was the first high-value detainee, as it was defined at the time, to be put through the CIA's torture program, otherwise known as enhanced interrogation techniques. And he's still in Guantanamo. Indeed, I saw some of the comments online or in the chat. Supreme Court had a big discussion about Abu Zubaydah this past week, because he's been there without any ability to challenge his detention, and he's never been charged with any crime. So I'm doing a deep dive into that story. But back to this whole idea of war, it's interesting that these techniques that became, the CIA's techniques, which is then mutated and migrated like a virus throughout the system, they started because, the CIA was trying to think about, well, how can we brutalize somebody, but do it in a way where we won't be put in prison? And what they did was they went and discovered that that is to say the United States of America, in response to how our prisoners of war were treated in the Korean War, developed a number of schools. They're called SEER schools: Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And we teach resistance to brutal interrogations to our own soldiers. And in those schools, soldiers are waterboarded, for example. They're put in stress positions, all these things. And so out of those wartime techniques came these interrogation methods, which is a completely lunatic idea, because it was never designed to get accurate intelligence. It was only designed to get people to say what the interrogators wanted to hear, or to give false confessions for propaganda purposes. But be that as it may, anyway, these techniques, which became the torture techniques, also mutated and migrated from war training, the SEER schools. Sorry, it's a very, it's a long, kind of tangent, but it seemed connected.
Yeah, I think that backstory and that genealogy in the film is really valuable and important. Another thing that's worth mentioning is I think you mentioned one or two cases of extraordinary rendition as well in the film. And one thing that I'm always surprised that people don't know is that, if you're talking about pre 9/11, also the post 9/11 era up until this day, the most common relationship between the U.S. and torture is one of outsourcing, right? The violence of the war on terror, much of it, in fact, I would say most of it, is actually carried out by client states of the U.S. acting, at their behest, under their influence, of course, with sometimes fraught relationships. But what's really striking about this period, during the Bush administration, is that the U.S. decided that tried and true system of outsourcing torture wasn't enough, that they also had to basically cut out the middleman and do some of it themselves, right? And that of course created the various sorts of crises and contradictions that the film brings to light so well. So at this point, I thought it might be interesting to look at a clip that aired just a few weeks ago. Anyway, I won't say that much about it because it explains itself, but I think it might give us some food for thought in reflecting on, the passage of time and how to read this film over time. So if we could bring the clip up, that would be great.
Call it Little Guantanamo or Afghanistan's Abu Ghraib. Heading back to the notorious Bagram prison, these are some of the former prisoners. It's not easy to find the way in the sprawling 30 square kilometer town. Even the Taliban had to stop for directions. But once you enter, the scale of the prison complex, which once held tens of thousands of people, becomes evident. Building after building, door after door, the men which were once held here remember their humiliation and torture at the hands of US soldiers and fellow Afghans. Imitating what the guards did, they wouldn't let me sleep, says Fareed, who spent 7 years in different cages. He was in physical therapy for extensive torture by Afghan and American troops. He says tortured prisoners were hidden in another block, away from media and humanitarian organizations, until they would heal.
My legs are still weak and in pain. They yanked my private parts with a cable. I was bleeding from it for almost 6 years. No matter how many times we said we didn't do the crime, they would torture until the prisoners said yes.
From uniforms to prison cells, inmates here have been telling us that this was one of the worst places to have been mentally tortured. If they did not behave well, these air conditioners would blow very cold air during the winter and very hot air during the summer. Picked up in a night raid, Maulvi Hashmi remembers being blindfolded and paraded naked in the early years of the prison. He thinks they were being fed dog food, smelly meat as he remembers it.
American girls would come dressed in bikinis to take us to the toilet. We got 3 minutes for a bath and these girls would watch us. Then there were no Afghan guards here. Nobody was allowed, not even the Red Crescent. They made us watch sexually explicit films and we weren't allowed to look away. We were sleepless. Our interrogations were almost 10 to 12 hours.
Rights groups such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and the American Civil Liberties Union have corroborated similar testimonies of torture and abuse. In 2004, the US Army charged 27 soldiers and enlisted personnel with criminal offences, some with maiming and involuntary manslaughter. Some prisoners were teenagers. They say others were brought from different countries on rendition flights. The complex was also home to the largest military base, a lifeline for US-led coalition troops in Afghanistan. Ahead of secretly leaving the base at night, US forces say they destroyed nearly 15,000 pieces of equipment and sent over 700 loaded C-17 aircraft out of Afghanistan. Scrap is what's left of Black Hawk helicopters, generators, vehicles and other equipment. But the real stain on the legacy is the abuse. Tens of thousands illegally detained without trial. That's how they'd wake us up, says Qari Shahabuddin.
They knew we'd be upset if they disrespected the Quran, so they'd throw it in the toilet. I spent almost a year here. It was a scary place. Bagram was a place of utter cruelty and barbarism.
Taliban fighters say they feel happy to be here once again as victors, not captives. Some feel the world knew them as barbaric monsters, which is how they see their captors. Sama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Bagram Prison.
So why don't we go in reverse order? I would just be curious about your reflections and thoughts, Anand.
Yeah, I would wonder how many of those people had been in the Taliban before that experience. This is, as I said earlier, many people I know joined the insurgents because of the kind of experiences that they witnessed in Bagram or elsewhere. And it wasn't just them, they would go back home to their village and they would tell their friends and their relatives, etc., what they had experienced. And so they were really like one of the biggest recruiters for the Taliban over the years was Bagram. And as I mentioned before, not just Bagram, all these smaller bases where similar kinds of things were happening. Often they were held for just a couple of days in these smaller bases before they were transported to Bagram, but the same sort of things were happening there. So, the US, more than any other actor, was the force that was fueling the Taliban insurgency from the very beginning.
Anila?
I appreciate that you selected that clip to go along with the discussion of the film, Darryl. So much to comment there, but just add to, Anand, and even in Al Jazeera's caption, so granted that they said that they're part of the Taliban now, it makes me think, because the captions that Al Jazeera chose were former Bagram detainee. Right? Would the audience's reaction different if it said Taliban? Right? And how like the barbaric nature of the Taliban and what has been everyone's been focusing on, like largely for the past 2 months since the takeover of the Taliban, right, is how barbaric the Taliban are. Right? And is there a way that we can talk about how barbaric the Taliban are alongside that which produced the Taliban, and which is the U.S. occupation and prior to U.S. empire, right? So how can we do all of these at the same time, right? And I'm just wondering if how Al Jazeera thought through that, right? Like not calling them Taliban in the captions, but Bagram detainee, so they get some sympathy, right? Because we don't, and again, I'm not trying to sympathize and say that the Taliban need sympathy. I'm trying to say, right, let's look at all forms of violence here and the barbaric nature of all the violence, right? And when they're detailing what happened to them and how they were treated, what do viewers and people think, and how we think of them being subject to torture? Is it deserved because now they are part of the Taliban? Right, as Anand pointed, right, what were they before part of the Taliban? But my point is, like, just looking at how we measure violence and who is the author of that violence, right?
Yeah, and just responding to that, the question that jumped to mind for me is, well, what happens now? Does this become a new prison run by the Taliban, which kind of speaks to your point about thinking about continuities of violence and their technologies? Another possibility is, I was thinking of the Ghraib prison that was run by the South Lebanon Army, the proxy force for Israel's occupation of South Lebanon. Ghraib was this notorious detention center that was turned into a museum after Israel's withdrawal from South Lebanon. And then that museum was subsequently bombed by Israel during the 2006 war, which is a whole other, so memorialization, repurpose, these are some of the potential afterlives of a carceral site like the Bagram prison. Alex, what did you think about this? This is returning to the scene of the crime, of your crime film, as it were.
Well, there's nothing that much surprises me about it. I mean, Taxi to the Dark Side, we had a lot of testimony. We were actually the very first people to actually publicly display images of some of the cells and airlocks, as they called them, at Bagram prison. So none of that really surprises me. But, I am interested in the discussion, both because of what, in terms of what, Anila, you said, and also, Anand, what you said. I'm afraid, and much to the dismay of my wife, when we go places, I make it a kind of a mission of mine to go to. When we went to Cambodia, I made sure to go see the Khmer Rouge prisons that where they also made great use of the waterboard. I spent a great deal of time in the new East German prison, where you can understand a lot of what was done by the Stasi. Sadly, there's a kind of universality to this brutality, but almost inevitably, there is a sense of, well, we're the good guys, so it's okay for us to do it. And what we're doing is not so bad because we're doing it for a good cause, which is, again, to take there's a police term for that. It's called noble cause corruption. And Americans, I think, are particularly afflicted with this, this was the just cause. This was payback for a 9/11, and now we were going to get the bad guys. And in order to get the bad guys, we had to get tough, without really thinking about what it was that we were doing, that we were, essentially abandoning our own principles in order to supposedly defend them, or stated principles, I should say.
Any other thoughts or reactions to the clip or anything else that Alex said, Anand and Anila?
Well, Darryl, one thing that struck me, because I've been to the Ghraib prison before and after it was bombed by Israel, is that Afghanistan's been at war for 40 years, and there isn't actually any type of memorial, as far as I know, either a memorial of the horrific violence meted upon Afghans by the Soviets, or by the Northern Alliance and the other commanders in the Civil War, or the Taliban, or now by the Americans, which I think speaks to part of the way in which the memories have been sort of politicized in Afghanistan. So why is it that there hasn't been any memorial to the violence committed pre-2001, except or even it's not even talked about unless it's by the Taliban? It's because the U.S. intervened and basically backed a whole set of actors who were some of the biggest war criminals in the country from the beginning. And so, it remains to be seen if that cycle is going to continue or not. What Afghanistan really needed in 2001 was some sort of truth and reconciliation process between the various sides. It was a fractured society after 2 decades of war at that point. Instead, the United States intervened, picked one side and said, you guys are the winners and the good guys, the other side are the bad guys. And Afghans are the only ones who've suffered as a result.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, this issue of memorialization is really interesting because, one is you usually need a clear winner, right? It's the victors that build the monuments, and there have been self-declared victors in Afghanistan, but their victories have, often been pretty ephemeral, right? So there's that kind of, monumental aspect, but there is also at the level of just popular memory, there is the practice of building shrines or dargahs around the graves of people who are martyred, right? And then those also become sites for people to visit and to venerate, right? Whether it's family members, or even people who may not have known the person, but feel a certain kind of spiritual significance in those sites. I mean, I've never been to Afghanistan myself, so this is only something that I've read about. But yeah, I was wondering if you could say something about that aspect of how people are remembering and commemorating the violence that's happened outside of these sort of official channels.
You
go ahead.
For Anand? Yeah. So just to add on that, I mean, for me, I spent a lot of time at cemeteries, right? And so a lot of families, like cemeteries are a place for having picnics, right? And they spend hours there, right? Commemorating those who left this world, right? And it's and certainly at ziyarats, right? That's where I would meet quite a lot of widows. So one of my frequent, at least 3 to 4 times a week, I would go to different ziyarats throughout Kabul city.
Sorry, Anila, I think for the audience, you might want to unpack a little bit like what ziyarat and tawassul and these things are.
I'm just going to say shrine, right? In the sense of, that's a place where widows also who are very vulnerable. So they, that was a place where they could get food for their families, right? So people would be cooking food there from early in the mornings, usually Thursdays, and they would make it available to anyone who needed food, right? So it was kind of a vibrant community in these spaces, but there's always a remembrance, like even in the homes, right? In Afghan family homes, there's if you speak to widows and their families, there's all like a little space that has the picture and little things that they can put that belong to the family member, right? And they'll when they're speaking of them, they bring it to you, whether it's an official picture that was taken for their work or something, right? And they start telling you and narrating their stories, right? So, whether it's in public spaces or even in their own homes, they do often, instead of saying commemorate, I'm going to say speak with those that left this world, right? They're still very much part of their everyday, right? A lot of my research with widows were women who were serially widowed, right? So they were widowed in the 80s to be then remarried, which is already a difficult decision, to then be widowed again, to then be remarried, to then be widowed again, right? So serial widowhood that goes along with the serial war, right? And just thinking through that, analytically, but just even at the everyday, what does that mean about there would be households where every single person from 17 to 65 were widows, every woman, right? And that was not uncommon, right? So how do we think about then the different ways that, like I said, the everyday and not necessarily spectacular ways that people commemorate and memorialize, right? It is in their living room, in the small spaces that they have. It is in the public spaces in ziyarats. I can comment more, but that's what I have to say right now.
And just one thing to add to that, which is, one of the things that struck me in the film is just a reminder of the Manichaean discourse that the Bush administration at that time put out, either with us or against us. The world is sort of neatly delineated into different camps. And the way in which that delineation doesn't map onto the reality of people's experiences. And Darryl, I think you would know about this because I think you've written about this. There's, for example, shrines of members of Al-Qaeda, Arab people, which I visited in Kandahar, for example. These are Wahhabis who, normally reject the idea of having people visit shrines. They think this is a kind of traditionalist way of doing Islam, which is wrong and is not in line with the way the Prophet did it. So they actually oppose this. They were killed largely in 2001 during the fight against the Americans. And then local Afghans, especially Afghan women, would go and visit these shrines. And so they had a very different understanding. They didn't see these shrines as Al-Qaeda in the way we think of Al-Qaeda as like, the people who attacked the World Trade Center. They thought of them as like holy men, for example, not that they had any political understanding in the way we think of it. And so they would just go to these shrines. There's multiple cases, however, where the US arrested families for going to these shrines, thinking that because you're going to these shrines, you must be supporting Al-Qaeda as a political project. And many innocent people got arrested in that way.
Yeah, thank you. That's all super fascinating.
If I can just, sorry, Darryl, if I could just...
No, go for it. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think, one of the reasons that the torture techniques were developed, and they were developed by one man in particular, but really two men, one man in particular, who had no understanding of of Afghanistan, of the world from which many of the detainees came. It was supposed to be a magic bullet, and it was supposed to be a magic bullet that you could just apply. But, jumping off of what Anand said, it's just the staggering ignorance with which the American Imperium went into Afghanistan was really what caused, ever more resistance and opposition to it, not surprisingly. And that the techniques devised to interrogate people, which, by the way, is supposed to be a way of getting good intelligence, was supposed to move beyond any need for understanding anything. Because whatever you think about, intelligence or interrogating somebody, the way traditionalists do it is a kind of human process of rapport building. The invention of the CIA was to come up with a method that that made ignorance a virtue, which clearly didn't work out so well in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and resonating with that is a comment from the audience from Sahar Gomkor, who writes, the US torture regime was less invested in extracting knowledge and more about the spectacle of punishment, humiliation, and exercising pure sovereignty. But we are meant to see this as rational, measured, purposive, legal, compared to the violence of others, right? So the state's trying to always have it both ways, to be the one who seems more, enlightened and careful and intelligent, but then part of the point of some of this violence is the excess, right? Is just like because we could, right? And just so that that we are willing to sort of transgress these limits. So this tension is always sort of there, and I think that's also running throughout the atrocities that the film exposes so well. We're nearing the top of the hour, so I thought it would be, I would just welcome each of you to share your sort of final thoughts on the film or on our discussion. Alex, why don't we start with you?
Well, I don't want to sum up, but I'll just jump on the comment from that person. I mean, I think in a weird way, the more pernicious aspect of what happened here with the U.S. torture regime was not. It was clearly a desire for revenge and a desire to inflict pain. I do agree with that, but I also think there was another agenda. And what these techniques would almost inevitably get is they would get prisoners to say exactly what it was the interrogators wanted to hear, which, if you think about it, is a really terrifying idea. And that's the notion of, that Orwell raises in 1984. It's a boot stamping on a face forever. And but it fools people into rationalizing their behavior in terrifying ways. And I don't mean rationalizing as saying that's a good thing. I think in a way it's a terrible thing. But just one last point, the legalizing of torture, I think it was done for one purpose and one purpose only. It was to keep the people who were doing it out of prison. The folks at the CIA didn't want to go to jail because they knew if they just went ahead and did it and tortured people, they would. And that's why they destroyed the tapes of the torture of Abu Zubaydah, for example.
Right. Anand?
I was muted. Just to add to that, the film is really important, and I think it should be watched again now that this brief moment that Afghanistan's back in the news. It seems like once every 20 years it's in the news, and so people should watch it. But I guess I'll just end with Anila's coming off Anila's comments from earlier, which is that when we don't see these images of torture, the war itself kind of recedes into the background. And I think that has been part of the problem. And it was really, so the film came out in 2007. I think a lot of interesting things happened post-2007 under the Obama administration, where a lot of this stuff was outsourced, again, to local actors. Some of the worst violence was done by Afghans, and it was enabled by the US or in the name of the US. And the sanitization of war allowed, I think, a lot of us to kind of forget that there was even a war in Afghanistan. So when I was going back to Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago, everyone is telling me, everybody I knew, friends and family, please be safe, please be careful. And I was like, where were you the last 10 years? I was going all the time. And it was way more dangerous in the last 10 years than now. I mean, there's terrible things happening now because the Taliban's in power. But the one good thing is that at least for the moment, there isn't people dying because of war. That may change as things progress. But it just shows to me the extent to which the reality of war is completely receded from our public imagination. And so we have to collectively think about ways to sort of raise that again for Americans.
Yeah. Anila, last word?
Yeah, that's difficult. Last word. I wanted to say again, thank you so much, Alex, for making the film. I certainly will be teaching it in my courses moving forward. So I appreciate you putting out that piece of work. Just building on what everyone has said here, right? Alex mentioned before the ignorance, and Anand, the folly of the U.S. and U.S. empire, right? And I want us to, think on that and think about, when we call it ignorant, is that a turn toward innocence, right? And sort of a redemptive claim for the United States, like if we could have, we would have known better. We would have done different if we only knew better, right? So for me, it's I totally get what you're saying, right? And ignorance certainly can describe so much of how and what was done, right? But I'm also hesitant, right? Because I don't want there to be a redemptive turn, right? And as we continue to think on Afghanistan, and not just of what's happened in the last 2 months, but 43 years and 20 years, right? However we bracket, the time and what's happened with Afghans, I hope we continue to be critical. Yeah, we also need to think about why is it that maybe many liberals, I'm not going to say every American, but many, at least liberals, know Abu Ghraib, right? And will know, oh, that's the prison in Iraq. How come very few will know Bagram, right? In your film, and I remember watching it, it was the first time someone referenced Bagram as that was where people learned what to do in Abu Ghraib, right? That was like sort of the testing ground. That's where people like sort of refined than what was done later, right? And for me, again, it has to do to the larger idea of Afghanistan being the war that made sense, right? We can critique the war in Iraq. People went to the streets globally for the war in Iraq, right? But it wasn't as many critical thoughts and ideas about the war in Afghanistan. And so for me, like I said, just back to the original comment, I'm really, really grateful for putting a spotlight on Bagram, what's happened there, and in the larger virus of war and the regime of war. Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful thinking with all of you.
Yes,
Thanks
thank you,
all of you.
everybody. Thank you, Anila.
Thanks,
Thank you.
and also thanks to the
great pleasure.
Also to the organizers of the festival. I just wanted to give everyone a shout out, and thank
Yes,
you all.
thank you,
Thanks to the
Lena.
audience as well. Thank you, Lena.
So long, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.